Bienvenidos. It's so good to welcome everybody here. It's such a warm and wonderful occasion for us to reflect together on where we are in pursuing the dreams we all share of keeping this planet beautiful for both people and for nature. And we couldn't have a more inspiring guest than we have today to lead us in thinking about what we can all do in our own mindset, in our own lives, and then how we work together to try and achieve this most crucial dream for ourselves and future generations. And it's a deep, deep honor to welcome President Alvarado of Costa Rica. I'll tell you a tiny bit about him, but I encourage you to look him up yourself. He's done so many different things. And among them, he's gone to school in the UK. He's served as Minister of Human Development and Social Inclusion in Costa Rica. He worked for FONAFIFO, for those of you who know, an institution that was pioneering in Costa Rica in offering payments, investments in forest because of the value of standing, living rainforest for human society. So he's been in so many pioneering roles. He's also written books. He's only 39, and it's just incredibly inspiring to see the diversity of his experience being deployed to help think about this transition that we're all trying to make in places all over the world and seeing it actually happening in Costa Rica. I'll just say one more thing there, that as a country and as a family of people living in Costa Rica, there's just been tremendous leadership and change in waking people up to the values of the environment, of nature in our own lives, and then to designing really transformative institutions like the first ever national payment system that I was referencing for protecting rainforest. And now we're witnessing the creation phase of a new set of institutions, a new kind of mindset around climate, and a new set of investments to transform a modern economy into a decarbonized, carbon-free economy. And let's all bring a warm, warm welcome to President Alvarado, and get your questions ready for later.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Gretchen. And I have to say I'm very pleased to be here today delivering this or sharing some thoughts on what's our decarbonization plan. We just launched it past February 24th to Costa Rica, but also to be aligned with what we committed in Paris, in the Paris Agreement, because we do believe as a world we need to move forward in that direction. But my approach, and that's a bit what I want to share, it's what I do believe we need now in the world in terms of climate change and environment. And that's why I want to talk about why this is the biggest challenge of our generation. And by generation, I mean everybody that's alive now in today's world. So I want to talk about freedom, will, and change. Why? Because those are things that really me apasionan, as we say in Spanish. I'm really passionate about it. When I was younger, I tried not to make age an issue, but I've seen it is. I've seen head of state that just stare at me and say, and I'm talking about decarbonization and stuff, and they stare at me and say, your hair is black. You're completely black. But when I was younger, things that really were passionate me was freedom and will and how to change things. Art, because that's the way you can change and create music, poetry. But then I started thinking I want to change things in my country, in Costa Rica. I'm really passionate about that. And then I remember reading Jean-Paul Sartre, and there was a passage that said that the thing that differentiates us from birds, for example, is that we can decide. We can show will. We can demonstrate where we want to go. And I know there's another view that thinks that everything is determined and everything is set, but I choose to believe not. I choose to believe that it's free will and it's freedom that drives us for change. So I said to myself, there's one thing I need to do in order to change things in Costa Rica. And that was to get out of Costa Rica. And at that moment, that appeared to be the right thing to do. And that's me, and I can see myself reflected in some of you here when I went to uni at Sussex, because I felt like I had to go there to reach out where knowledge was, to find that knowledge, and then bring it back home, bring change back home. That was my approach. And I think several of us think of that. We need to go out there and look at what we are looking for there to create. And that was, at the time, my approach. And I remember back then when I was the only Costa Rican in the whole campus, I have to say. And I used to have one flag just like the one the guy over there showed, and I keep showing my flag, but I was really passionate about, because, and there were friends of mine telling me, stop talking about Costa Rica, you're always talking about Costa Rica. And I was telling them all the things I was going to do back in Costa Rica. I was looking for change elsewhere. And then I realized a couple of things. Change in several areas. For example, critical things for human development. In my previous life as a Ministry of Human Development, I was in charge of tackling poverty. So poverty was a thing that really passionated me at the time, and still does. And we were thinking about, well, social security systems. Which are the best social security systems in order to drive human development? And there was the example of the NHS in England, which appeared to be really compelling. Peace. So then there were the examples of, and it was funny because I believe in this campus I saw over nearby that same picture here, really inspiring picture of Gandhi and of Martin Luther King, because of the relevance of peace movements and how to drive change. But then I realized something that really struck me while I was there, being the only Costa Rican in the UK, and it was this. The NHS was created in 1946, and the social security system in Costa Rica was created in 1941, 5 years before that. And the picture you see there on top, those three guys, during Second World War II, they reached an agreement to create social security. One of them is the president, the one from the left. He was a Republican president. The person on the right was the leader of the Communist Party. And the person of the middle was the chief of the Catholic Church. So the three of them reached an agreement, and after that, Social Security was created in Costa Rica. That happened 78 years ago. And now our life expectancy reaches about 80 years. And realize, then that started to have an effect on me. What am I looking for? What am I looking for? And then I was thinking about peace movement and how to drive peace. But last December, being president, I had the honor to celebrate the 70th anniversary of Costa Rica, a country without an army. So I started to rethinking about the importance of those values, of our own traditions, of the things we carry within us that we need to be true and that need to inspire us. This is the results of Costa Rica's life expectancy and GDP per capita. As you can see, our GDP per capita, it's somehow modest compared to others, but our life expectancy is high, very high, because of this solidary system that we created 78 years ago. And here is the result, the performance of our economy in blue on a recent study from the University of Costa Rica compared to what would have happened if we hadn't abolished the army. And those were decisions took on the decade of the 1940s, which I believe changed positively the world and started creating who we are as a people and what we can give to the world, to our people, to the world, and to others. Here is a bit of another example, and Gretchen mentioned it. I used to work on that. And it's about forests, and it's also a relevant story. Costa Rica development started to, as in many countries, a strong deforestation in order to widen the agricultural frontier. So that green line represents how in the 1950s we have 72% of coverage of forest. We're a tropical country and we have 5% of biodiversity in our land. So a rapid decrease in that coverage occurred in those decades until the decade of 1980-1990, when we realized that the coverage of forests in country reached about 23%. So at that time, other leaders, by the way, I was born in 1980, so that's not my merit, I have to say. So many people decided not only to create a national park system, but also to create reserve areas. And as they realized it was not enough, they created a scheme called Payment for Environmental Services. So it's a payment that it's given to those owners of forests for the service the forests provide to the society in terms of water protection, in terms of tourism, because of the biodiversity, the landscape, in terms of biodiversity as well. And the thing is, in 2 decades, we managed to reverse the trend from 23% in the 80s to more than 54 in the last measure is of 2013. And our commitment is to reach up to 60% of coverage. The other line is very important as well, because in the 1980s, at the time of the discussion, many people argue that that kind of policy will harm economic growth. And I believe we've heard that a lot, don't we? That those policies are against economic growth, will harm economic growth. It's unthinkable of doing that. But then the red line represents how the GDP has grown since. And we heard that before. It's not possible to create a social security system. It's not sustainable. 78 years from then, we have that. Actually, our ambassador who's joining us, he used to be president of our Social Security, if you want to give him some of those questions. 70 years ago, it's impossible to live without an army. You will not survive. And then here we are. And our Minister of Trade, she's the granddaughter of the President Figueres, who enforced that policy. Before you can ask her as well. And even before that, in the past In the 19th century, Costa Rica abolished, one of the first countries to abolish the death penalty. And that's part of our legacy. And the same people that took those decisions created an electric grid today that is 99.5 clean and renewable in its production. Again, not my merit, but their merit, their vision. Actually, the law of the institution that triggered that mentions, and this was written in this year, that ICE, the institution that develops our energy, is going to be 70 years old. In its law, it clearly states to develop clean energy at that time. And that's the result of that. We have basically 99.5% clean renewable energy, driven mainly by hydroelectric power, but now we are diversifying because we know we need to diversify those resources. But that's one of our current great opportunities. And why am I showing this? I'm showing this because it's our responsibility. This comes with a great responsibility. Why? Because it represents that, yes, it is possible to do it. It's a living example that decarbonization can be real. It's real. It's true. As our Minister of Environment said, we started decarbonization 2 decades ago, even when we were not aware that that was a concept, because we started planting more forests. And we started decarbonization when we built a clean electric matrix that was not dependent on fossil fuels. And there is one of the greatest opportunities we as a country have, which is plug that electric grid into our production and into our transportation and eliminate fossil fuels at all. And that's the plan we presented in past February. So that's the big new challenge. And actually, for me, that's the challenge of our generation in terms of being citizen of Costa Rica. If our grandfathers were capable of standing the test of time and doing those things, it's the burden I carry on my shoulders and on my team to stand up to that legacy and deliver. And whenever confronted to the term of that's impossible, or scale, but that's small scale. Our challenge is to move forward and to demonstrate it is possible. So this is what it looks, what we are trying to achieve in decarbonization and in economic growth. So the blue curve is the curve of our projection of growth for the next couple of decades. And the green one is how we are planning to decrease the usage of fossil fuels throughout this transition to the year 2050, where we are expected to completely eliminate our use of fossil fuels. It's not much of a picture, but it's quite challenging to make it happen. So I'm going to give a bit on what the areas are of decarbonization. I have to say, if you want to deep dive on this, you can go on the information we've got online, and it's more detailed. It's also important to say one thing. It doesn't mean that we necessarily have figured out every little detail about it. But that's part of the challenge. There are many things that we do not know yet how we're going to fix. But does that mean that we are not going to start with the first step? No. We need to take the decision. It's about will. It's about freedom. It's about doing it. So these are the 10 focus areas that we are developing. First is sustainable mobility and public transportation. During my administration, we're going to build 2 electric trains connected to the clean electric grid. One in the metropolitan area to reduce dramatically emissions, and another cargo train from the center of San Jose, Costa Rica capital, to the Caribbean, where is the main port. So this for transportation and for cargo transportation. Also, we're going to change the mobility of the way the buses operate in, which are the main producers of carbon emissions. So transportation and all the change, that's why it's so important, the First Lady, my wife, because she's an architect, she's really involved and she's helping me and our team to develop this, because that might be the most important piece that we have to deliver. Why? Because from the 100% of energy we use, electricity is only 30%. And that's the 30% we already have the job done, it's clean. But the rest of the 70% fossil fuels is mainly on transportation and still in some of our production. So, but then that's the opportunity to use our electric grid and increase our electricity demand. That's electrifying our transportation. So that's number one, that's the big building block. But it's not enough. We are also changing our vehicle fleet to a zero-emission fleet, and we're really pleased actually here in the West Coast. We are already seeing what we want to see in Costa Rica, the electric vehicles, and we are driving those. We already passed a bill to make a tax relief on the import of electric vehicles, so it makes it easier. Public institutions are buying electric vehicles. On 2021, when we renew the contracts of public transportation, we're going to aim for the private sector to buy those technologies also to reduce emissions. Efficient freight transportation related to the cargo train. For large transportation, technology is not yet, because batteries are too heavy, as many of you know, but then we're going with mix of renewable or fossil fuels with biofuels to reduce emissions. Actually, just during this tour, we were in Seattle and we were talking with the port authorities, and they have this very interesting developments on fuels for airplanes. They have mix of fossil fuels with renewable, with biomass, having outstanding results, but now you have to figure out the economics. But there are developments already. Well, renewable electric energy at competitive costs, because we need to preserve a competitive cost on our electricity. Also too, especially thinking of the economic growth, it needs to be sustainable. Smart cities, low emissions in sustainable buildings. That's the part of the equation I just give to my wife and say, okay, you handle this because you're the architect, you know that, and I handle the politics. Which is not that, sometimes it's not that fun. Also, commitment with the industrial sector, a seventh step, which is one that's critical, and I have to say, we do not stand up yet to our reputation in waste management, and I have to say that because it's true, and we need to do a lot on that. But we're working on strategies because we can use the organic part for our agriculture sector, and we can do lots on that and return the minerals and return everything to the land instead of pulling value into landfills, which is what is happening. And we have a very strategic agenda. In low carbon food systems, we have advanced, for example, in coffee. Coffee is one of our main exports, so we have agroforestry systems to reduce emissions, and we are certificated that kind of coffee as well to add value to that coffee, and doing other social things to add value to coffee. For example, many coffee plantations, the ones that pick up the beans are migrants indigenous migrants from Panama. But then we have nurseries and houses for the children of those who come to pick up the coffee, so we can stimulate and preserve that human talent as well for the next generation. Low emission livestock, again, for agroforestry systems, and actually there are really relevant developments. There's a company that had developed a kind of compound you give to the livestock, and they reduce dramatically their emissions. So that's the kind of things we need to keep exploring. and also the management of territory. So these 10 areas are the parts of the plan that we deep dive with the actions, but as a very intelligent woman, my son's teacher says, the best plan, it's a flexible plan. And why? Because there are things that we do not yet know, but then we need to keep moving forward. That's a bit, if we want to go in a schematic, those are the 10 trends of our decarbonization plan. Other things we knew, we need to change the institution. On this March, we're going to start changing some of the institutions. We're going to change a bill, introduce a bill to change the institution that handles fossil fuels in Costa Rica. Green tax reform to the day, sorry, are you okay? Okay. To the day, the comparison is that using electric vehicles, for example, can be at least 5 times cheaper than we have currently fossil fuel vehicles. And that's why we already introduced a tax on fossil fuels that's used to finance the payment of environmental services. So that's a legacy we have. So the finance we're also, and I have to be clear about this, we're moving forward fast because that also we committed in Paris, we committed to be a decarbonization lab, but also because as first movers, we want also to attract the attention of investment. That's also a strategy because we want to make things happen. We want to lead by example. Digitalization is also a key part of it, and that's why we also are here in Silicon Valley. It's something that many people don't know also of Costa Rica. You've asked somebody about which is the main export of Costa Rica. Many people will say, well, coffee. But the main export today of Costa Rica, it's medical appliances. And there are companies such as Intel, Procter & Gamble, Baxter, Hewlett & Packard, both of them. And there are more than 30 large companies that have their operations in Costa Rica. The largest McKinsey hub is based in Costa Rica. Why? Because of human talent. And why? Because of the decisions we took 70 years ago about not funding military but funding education. And that we're trying to build more robust knowledge and education-based society. So these are many other things that we need to put into place. Open data strategy, that's key. Well, gender and equality, those are key in order to make this happen. It's relevant to say also that the last election in Costa Rica was not, was part of what we experienced globally in terms of, of more populist wave in democracies. And in the middle of the election was the choice or the egalitarian marriage, which we supported from the beginning. And at one point, and that was critical for our legacy, some people were trying to take out Costa Rica from the Human Rights Court, which has been in San Jose for the past 40 years. So we had to stood up for our legacy, and thank God, well, we're here talking. But this to say that legacy is not for granted. We need to protect things, and it's very important to do that. So this is talking about legacy. Over here is Francisco Alvarado and Berta Induni. And over there is Manuel Quesada and Noemi Alvarado. So those are my grandparents. They're already gone, but they were part of the generation when they were young, and they were on the generation that took decisions. That was their generation that abolished the army and that created the clean electric grid and the national park system. None of them finished grade school. None of them finished grade school. But they had the courage. That generation had the courage to do the right thing. That's part of our legacy. So we are the heirs of a beautiful tradition of innovation and change. And that's why we're doing this as well. That's why we're doing it. Not because it's fashionable. It's because it's an ethical responsibility. That's why we're doing it. It's the right thing to do. And we all must do it. That's the Sulawesi cave. It's one of the first pieces of art of humanity. It's 37,900 years old. Well, more than that. It's almost 40,000 years old. But look at the hands. Look at those hands. And look at your hands. What really strikes me is how far away in time that is and how similar to us. That's us. And how many generations have lived and died. And how many cultures, religion, pieces of art, of literature, of science has been created since. But from all human generations, there is only one that's now responsible of taking care of the heritage of the whole humanity. And it's ours. Those are my parents. That's my wife and my kid. But it's our family, our generation. From the whole generations of humanity, it's the one responsible of doing this. Now I have, or let's put it this way, in 2050, when the decarbonization plan is meant to be over, I'll be my dad's age. That's my dad, that's my mom. And my kid over there, he's going to be my age. And perhaps he will be in Stanford or someplace in 50 years. And there are two possibilities. One, he might be asking me, Dad, what did you do? Did you do enough at the time because of what's happening? Or perhaps he'll be picturing the future, a next vibrant and brilliant future for humanity. And that's the scenario I want. And that's the scenario I believe we all should be working for. We have the science, we have the technology. You know it here at Stanford better than anybody. We can work the data, we can work the analytics. But the thing which is less abundant today, it's passion, inspiration, drive. And that's what we need to have today in order to solve this problem we've created. So that's why we're doing the decarbonization plan, and I'm really thrilled to be here today in Stanford. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm Chris Field. I'm the director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. And on behalf of the Institute and the university, it's a wonderful honor to have President Alvarado here with us today. Our plan for the next few minutes is that Gretchen and I will engage in a conversation to follow up on a few of the issues that the President has raised. And then we're really going to turn the floor over to all of you and allow you to have a chance to have your voice heard and be a part of the conversation about decarbonization in Costa Rica and decarbonization in the world. President Alvarado, I know this is your second day on campus, and your first day you visited a virtual reality lab that's about touching the heart as well as the brain on the issue of decarbonization. And I wonder if you'd like to say a few more words about the way you see the role of technology helping people reach the passion that you've described as so important.
Well, it's true. What we saw yesterday in the lab, it's outstanding. I grew up being a Trekkie as well. a fan of Star Trek, and when I was there, I just said, this is the holodeck, which it is actually. But as we know from centuries, tools depend on how we use them. And that's why I put a lot of emphasis in my journey, I learned about it, on things such as values and traditions. Those technologies are not neutral. So it depends the purpose you put on them, how can develop them and make good change or only change. And the part that I found outstanding from the lab, it's that it's not only, but first is that it's within the communications department, and that's my department, so I felt great about it. But the second is, it's not only the lab, but it's the purpose. It has a purpose, and I do believe it's the same when we talk about 3D printing. It's the same when we talk about data analysis and data science. Ethics should be across all of those in order to improve quality of life when we use them. And one of the greatest causes I believe we have as humankind is climate change. So every piece of technology you can use with those values, it's worth trying, but in that direction.
Well, I know a lot of people here in the room, and thank you again for coming and just thinking about all of us and how hard we work, how committed we feel to the cause, how inspired we are. I wondered if you could share kind of at a personal level, how you keep your spirit going. Where do you get the courage? We're always trying to help one another and to keep up the courage or to grow in courage and do the things we think maybe only others can do. You've obviously really got it. So where's it come from?
Well, I think in the presentation I was already very personal with all the family and
yeah.
No, but I think that's why I also start with what are the passions and the drivers. I mean, if I've learned something is that the drive comes, reason is important and empathy is important, but it's passion that drives human beings. That's our main force. We need to be passionate about something in order to act. And one of my passions when I was a student actually in college, was that reflection on liberty and of free will. But for me, the strongest part of that, and that's really personal, was that liberty, it's mostly about responsibility. And whenever you're confronted to some reality, you're responsible of acting. And that tells a lot of your character. So I grew up feeling that as a burden, as I mentioned, because you feel responsible of many things. And on a personal note, again, I used to be minister in the previous administration in Costa Rica. I was the youngest minister of the cabinet. And when it was 2016, and at that moment, it was the year of Brexit. It was the year of the US election. It was the year of the peace referendum in Colombia. And we all thought that peace was going to prevail, but the referendum was lost. And for me, that I studied in the UK, having that many friends, young people, they were devastated because of Brexit at the time. And in 2016, I started also seeing those kinds of elements in Costa Rican politics, which eventually actually proved to be true. Populism, people attacking gay people, for example, in their politics. Candidates saying, we're going to close the Institute of Women, just like that. So I felt a huge responsibility to do something. And in my party, there was no candidate. So I said, well, I felt the responsibility to do something. I knew where we were heading, so I did that. But, and I say this a lot, but I find it to be an insight that's true. I think people get involved in politics, and yesterday we were talking with some people from Stanford, sometimes in business, for three main reasons. One reason people get involved in politics is because of money, and for the wrong reasons. So that's not really advisable. But there are lots of, but there are many people that involve in politics because of that. Another great reason is because of ego. Many people like the spotlight, like to be recognized. And that's not necessarily bad or wrong, but it's true. And the third element why people get involved is the sense of service and being useful and have a purpose for change. So those three are always in the political arena, and you have to deal with the three of them. Sometimes you have to deal with your own ego in this time. What I found is that ego is one of the greatest barriers to do the right thing sometimes. But for me, again, when you manage to do things that have purpose and provide change, that's enough pay. I mean, that's worth the ride. That's really worth the ride. To see change happen, good change happen, that's worth the ride. So I believe, I encourage many of you to take that ride for good change.
Fabulous.
President Alvarado, you present a compelling and really inspiring picture of a pathway for decarbonization for Costa Rica. But climate change is the archetype of a global scale problem. And I wonder if you could say a few words about your vision of how leadership from Costa Rica can help move the needle for actions in the rest of the world.
Yeah, that question I get a lot because it's true part of the dilemma. And it's really worth having a good answer. And I always try to give my best answer on this. First, for us, as I mentioned, it's not an option, it's an option, it's a must, because it's embedded on who we are. For me, it's not an option, it's something I have to do, because we have those conditions, we inherit those conditions, so we need to go to the next level. That in our case. But still it's the right thing to do. But also, in today's world, I believe we can lead, and we aim to lead through example. That's the best way to do it. Because whenever somebody said, no, it's not possible to reverse deforestation, then somebody can say, well, Costa Rica did it. No, it's not possible to have a clean electric grid. Well, there's a living example. So that's also a way to lead into action. But then comes the scale argument. The Costa Ricans, they believe they are the great deal, but they're just a small piece of land in Central America, so that's not really, that's not going to move the needle. That's the argument. By the way, the land in Costa Rica, it's only the actual 8% of our territory. The other 92% of our territory is our oceans. So we're much more larger than that, and with a whole ecosystem in the seas just waiting there to be discovered. That's something worth mentioning. So comes the argument of scale. But as I was telling before, there are two ways in which people can picture states or nations. And people tend to think as nations as individuals. And there are large individuals and there are small individuals. I mean, Costa Rica will be in a small individual, and let's say India, a large, very large individual, and so on, and they're medium size, whatever. But what truly is the same size and scale in all across the nations are individuals, actual individuals. We all count. And that's true. When you think about it, when you think about minds and individuals, in each and every country. Not from the perspective of, let's say, United Nations, but from the perspective of change that you can deliver, and it's in your hands, in your will, in your freedom, then the picture changes. It's not that straightforward that one individual, it's against climate change in terms of a nation. No, that's not necessarily true. So we need to start working at the person level. This is very personal. This is not necessarily a state or country discussion. This is a personal discussion. And it's really personal because it's about our future and our children's future. So my take on this is we rather discuss this at a actual one-to-one rather than thinking, well, this should be only solved on a state level, on a national level. So that's my point. That's why our example in that level is important, but also telling that everybody can do it in every scale.
Well, I'd like to maybe leave you with one final question that might help knit together some of the many things you've laid out, both on the intellectual side and emotionally, and thinking about the future. I'm really curious about your books. This is one of them. He's written some beautiful books, and they're historical. They're in the realm of ethics. And I wondered how you think about, the human arc. You're going back to the Sulawesi cave and thinking about our evolution and where we'll be in the future and our role all along the way. I just wondered, how does history grab you, and how does it factor into the way you lay plans and try to instill the hope and the vision in others?
Well, I think it has a very special place because I grew up listening a lot to my grandparents and to the people they talked about. And it's funny that in Costa Rica I can relate very well with people from elder generation, being myself what it's called to be a senial, I believe I am, but also being like in the middle, I can relate also to younger people. But I found that actually history, it's a very good source of knowledge. And when I was younger, as I have this drive to create, at the first time I tried to create from nothing, perhaps. But there's lots of knowledge, of not only on science, on the mind, but knowledge for the heart and for the soul in history and in people. So I tried to take from there to build upon. And I'm really passionate about narratives. And I think that the main problem we have today with climate change, but with many other problems, is the way we frame narrative. I think that's the main problem sometimes. And we don't have the appropriate storytelling or the appropriate approach so we can recruit the critical mass we need in order to do the right thing. So me coming from journalism, but also liking to stories, I think that's my main tool in order to make change. But then again, tools can be used in many ways. And there are also people framing narratives in very destructive ways, in very polarizing ways, in which I believe that's when not only the passion, but the mind has to come to work. And narrative is a very tricky job, but then that's why ethics is also very important as part of how you build your narrative.
Fabulous.
As we indicated at the start, we really want this conversation to be about all of you and your chance to interact with Costa Rica and the future of the world. And we don't have very much time for questions, but we still want you engaged. And so if you would like to ask a question, raise your hand, and please wait for the microphone, and if you wouldn't mind saying your name at the start of your question. And microphone runners are at the ready. Thank you, Roberta.
Hi, my name is Amir. Actually, as a Costa Rican citizen, it's a little weird to ask my president a question in English. But you spoke about ICE, the Costa Rican Institute of Electricity, and when it was founded in 1949, it was established as a monopoly. So I would like to ask what you think the role of governance and policy is in enacting change, and if you believe that left to market forces, for example, in a country like the United States, where they're less likely to enact social laws like this or establish a governmental monopoly, what do you think the role of governance is, and is there a balance between sort of laissez-faire and establishing a monopoly, or how do you think other countries should tackle enforcing change in their countries by policy?
Well, thanks on the question. And I have to say, I wouldn't dare to give advice to other countries, because I think everybody has to find their own path, their own way. We did find it years ago, and actually, yes, we built a state-owned monopoly to build electricity, and that proved at the time to be right, and not necessarily now. That's actually one of the challenges we are facing and we are fixing. It's a complex challenge because most of our electricity comes from hydroelectric. Many of the development now has to do with electric networks and solar panels. So the part of engineering and computing in distribution is critical. But we're basically passing from a centralized model to a more decentralized model, which for us is being a challenge. Also because of the the structure of our costs. So that's one of the challenges we're facing, and we're driving a whole restructuring of the institution debts so we can make it affordable while we're triggering transformation in our grids and so those are the challenges but within there, public policy has a key driver. You have to be in my approach, on the driver's seat, but with the private sector. You cannot alienate the private sector. And that's one of the main political issues involved in this. The good thing is to have the decision to go in that direction. Another of our great challenges is, for instance, we also have a state-owned oil import company. It's a monopoly. And I want to keep it that way. Why? Because if you open a market for the import of oil, what will be the incentive for reducing emissions? Given that the incentive is to sell more oil. But then it's public policy. You need to, and this is not not necessarily a national consensus on both of the topics. Then you need to persuade, and you need to go to an election and to have representatives appointed or win elections, so those visions get to be materialized. And that's also when the politics gets tricky. But then again, if you have a strong foundation of principles and a clear vision of where you're going, is as Lincoln says, and also very important, there is a great legacy over there, by the way. Actually, really inspiring for me many times. But Lincoln, and I think this is taken from the movie, but it's also in the book of, I can't remember it's called Team of Rivals, when he said that the compass helps you to point true north. But the compass is not telling you how to get there. It's telling you where you want to get. Then you have to figure out which is the best way so you can get to that true north. And that's part of our current struggle.
We can take one more question.
Thank you so much for being here. That was an incredible talk.
Thank you.
I actually had a question. You are 39 years old, and a lot of the people in this room are even younger than that, and you are the head of state of your country. And the idea of a 39-year-old president...
Isn't it crazy, huh?
It's pretty crazy, especially around here. So I would just love to know, like, what is your experience in terms of your, navigating things as a younger person, trying to convince a lot of people in an older generation to do things maybe differently?
To tell the truth, but that's perhaps something I have to check with my psychologist. But, but to tell the truth, I try not to think a lot of it. I try to focus on results. But then what I have found is that, for example, I found this a lot in women, in gay people, or in other specific groups. When I talk to them, they say, well, a couple of weeks ago, no, on the 8th of March, on the International Women's Day, I was talking to some police women, and they keep telling me, like, we have to do our best effort. And they tend to be better police women because they have to demonstrate that they can deliver. And that happens a lot with women. I have gay friends in work that they say, we have to be at the top of the list. Why? Because then again, you have to demonstrate something that like our societies have. And then I think to myself, well, sometimes it happened to me in that sense. When I was a minister, I was the youngest in the cabinet, so I keep trying to push myself to be better because I needed to deserve to be there. And I'm not sure if that's the right framing. I don't know. From another point of view, for example, our cabinet is 50-50 men and women. Our youngest minister is the minister of women from planning. She's 32, right? Our eldest minister is 82, the minister of transportation. We have people from different backgrounds, even from different parties, from different origins. But then there's also I think a learning from nature and from biodiversity. The more diverse the group is, as in nature, and the more diverse an ecosystem is, it protects itself better from threats. If it's all the same, it's very, very,
Vulnerable, yeah.
Yeah, a threat can harm all the individuals, where when it's diverse, it protects itself. So I like to think of myself of one individual with certain characteristics that's working with a team, very diverse team, to deliver results. So I try not to think of my age as I don't put my age in the middle of things, even though I know it's something that pops up frequently. But my advice is let's put it this way. When you or any of your colleagues saw me come in, and just by my look, being a young man, perhaps you form yourself an idea. Now you have a more concrete idea, not because of my age, but because of what I have said. So I think that's how we need to judge, not judge, but to value people, but real results. And those are there for people to then to judge, I believe. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I think you've inspired all of us to do better as a team supporting Costa Rica for sure, in any way we can. Buen amigos.
Thank
Stanford and Costa Rica, and maybe black hair, white hair, anything in between. We can all give 3 cheers to the best president. Thank you. Thank you.
Very generous.